President, please be seated. The court is now back in session. As the chamber already informed the parties to the proceedings already that this afternoon the chamber continues hearing civil party Denis Afonso through video conference from France. Counsels for the accused persons will have the opportunity to put questions to her. Good afternoon, Madam Afonso.
Bonjour, monsieur. Bonjour, monsieur le président.
Good afternoon.
The President. Next, the Chamber would like to hand over to counsels for Mr. Nguyen Chia to continue putting questions to you, so please be informed, Madam.
D'accord, je suis prête.
Thank you. I'm ready.
Thank you. The Chamber would like to now hand over to counsels for Mr. Nguyen Chia to put some questions to Madam Afonso if they would wish to do so.
Thank you, Mr. President, and good afternoon to everyone in and around the courtroom, and especially good morning to you, Madame Afonso. I, at the moment, do not see you in the screen, Madame Afonso. Mr. President, is there a way that we could have the civil party shown on the screen?
The President, we will follow the same practice, and we will hopefully, when she responds to your questions, and we hope to see her.
I understand. I will proceed.
The President, hold on, please, counsel. We appear to have experienced some technical difficulties now. We hope these problems are fixed soon, and then you may proceed.
n'entend rien. Nous sommes revenus.
C'est redéconnecté, j'ai l'impression. Ah non, c'est bon.
The President, counsel for Mr. Nguyen Chia, you may now proceed.
Thank you, Mr. President. Madame Afonso, good morning. My name is Jasper Pauw. I am international counsel for Mr. Nguyen Chia, and I will be asking you some questions this afternoon, morning, where you are. Madame Afonso, I could not help but hear before the proceedings started when you did a sound check that you were rather nervous for this questioning, and I want to tell you that I understand this and that I will be asking today straightforward questions based on your experience, and if you feel the questions are too complicated or too emotional, please do let me know, then we can move on to a next topic. Is this clear to you, Madame Afonso?
Yes, Counsel. I entirely understand.
I will today first start by asking you some questions relating to the situation in Phnom Penh before April 1975, and I will then move to the period that you spent in the countryside. First, the situation in Phnom Penh before April 1975. You have testified that during the Lon Nol years, many refugees entered Phnom Penh. Could you give us an estimate of how many refugees entered Phnom Penh?
Well, you're asking this question 32 years later. I can't give you the precise figures. All I know, and all I was able to see at the time, was that every day crowds of refugees arrived in Phnom Penh, and in the city then there were about 2 million inhabitants, and with all of these refugees who came in towards the end, before leaving the city, there were more than 3 million of us. But this is not a specific calculation that I have made myself.
I understand this. But when you were in Phnom Penh in that period, did you see the living conditions of those refugees that had entered the city?
Absolutely.
Yes. On their arrival, they had practically nothing. They had lost everything. They had left part of their lives in the villages that they had left. They told us about the trials and tribulations they had had before arriving.
And once they arrived in Phnom Penh, where would they live?
Il y en avait.
Some of them had families in Phnom Penh and lived with them. Others, who didn't have anybody at all, camped on the pavements. Now, I can't tell you about the living conditions of each and every one of these people because we ourselves were particularly traumatized by the situation at the time. There were shells falling and a battle was going on around the city, so we ourselves were very traumatized by the living conditions at the time.
And when you describe that these people camped on the pavements, did they camp on the pavements all across the city, or was that in specific areas of Phnom Penh?
Encore une fois.
Well, Counsel, I can't give you any accurate information on the subject apart from what I have just said.
Madame Afonso, I, of course, want you to only testify as to what you personally have seen, but in those 5 years of the Lon Nol regime, I assume you moved around Phnom Penh at times, and perhaps you have seen the refugees as they were camping on the pavements. And if that is true, could you describe whether these refugees were all over the city or whether they were focused more on one or several areas of the town?
I'm not sure I can tell you much about that. On the other hand, what I can tell you is that we saw a lot of the soldiers and military people from the pension fund, and they were sheltering a good many of their family from outside the city. On some of the main boulevards, like Monivong, we saw people living out and camping in a ramshackle way, but I can't give you any precise account of the overall situation. Most of these people were, in fact, accommodated by their friends and by their families.
Thank you. And you also yesterday spoke of the prices of food products, such as rice. Could you tell us a little bit more about the prices of food at the time in the years of the Lon Nol regime?
Well, Counsel, for the precise costs and prices, I would need to go back to my book. Now I'm in my 70s, so if you ask me now to recite off the precise prices, that I can't do. However, in my book I did put them down, and you can base yourself on that. If there are any mistakes, there's not much I can do about that. It's not infallible. But what you're asking me to tell you now, I really can't answer you. But I do know that all of the foodstuffs prices went shooting up. There was a big black market. There were Chinese traders in the cities who were running the black market. Even the sweetened condensed milk that we made in the Sokile factory went up in price very considerably. Now, if you're going to ask me this question again, I would have to pick up my book and quote the prices from what I recorded then, including the exchange rates, the real exchange rate as well, because in the French embassy I was paid half in francs and half in real. and my Chinese partner changed the francs into real so as to be able to buy enough food to eat.
Thank you. I think that is already a very detailed answer, and there's no need to refer to your book. I will quote one excerpt from that book on this topic, and your book has been referenced yesterday. It is the document number E9/32.2.29, and the ERN is 00678324. And for the translators, I will be quoting in French. Madame Afonso, in that book, you speak about une hausse vertigineuse du
an astronomical rise in the price of raw materials such as rice, vegetables, condensed milk, gas, and so forth.
And I apologize for my pronunciation, but here indeed you describe this strong increase in price of vital food products. That is indeed what is written in your book, and that is what you tell us today. Do you know, Madame Afonso, if the refugees that came into Phnom Penh and that were living in Phnom Penh, sometimes on the pavement, whether they had enough money to buy elementary foodstuffs all the way up to April 1975?
Council, once again, let me repeat that I have not had time to garner information so as to know if the refugees who were coming in and who were not actually housed by friends or family had enough to eat. I think that in those days the Lon Nol regime had enough resources with all the US assistance they were receiving in order to assist those people. But I personally didn't have the time to deal with all of these issues. My family was quite enough worry for me as it was, indeed myself too.
Thank you, Madame Afonso. I think that's a very clear answer, and I hear you saying that you do not know the situation that these refugees found themselves in. So I will move to the next topic, and that is the situation of the healthcare in Phnom Penh. Is it true, Madame Afonso, that the French government repatriated their doctors in the periods before the Khmer Rouge entered Phnom Penh?
Yes. From March 75, in other words, about a month before the Khmer Rouge arrived, the first military plane arrived at the start of the month of March, and those involved in official assistance and teachers were allowed to take those planes out. Then a second plane arrived in mid-March to take everybody else. And then the final plane came in just before the city fell. The people who left were the teachers, all the Westerners, the people working in assistance and cooperation, and that included a great many doctors from the hospitals in Phnom Penh. Is that clear, sir?
Thank you. That is very clear. Do you know if that also included French nurses?
Ah, mais je n'ai pas.
I don't know if there were French nurses who left council. I was in the cultural service. I certainly wasn't in the Ministry of Health. I wasn't working in health matters. I was working in the cultural sphere, and I saw teachers leaving. Now, you're asking me about French nurses? No, but there were Cambodian doctors and medical staff in the country. The wealthy people were able to jump ship before it sank. It was the poor who remained behind and who got killed.
Thank you. And do you know, Madame Afonso, what happened to the Vietnamese population of Phnom Penh during the Lon Nol years?
La population.
The Vietnamese population in Phnom Penh during the Lon Nol regime was partly repatriated to Vietnam, but a considerable majority were massacred on the way. I know about this because I saw Vietnamese people being killed in pagodas, and some of them were friends of my mother's, and there was a definite witch hunt for these people.
Alors maintenant, je n'ai aucun contrôle.
Now, I didn't take a tally of the numbers, and I didn't follow their travels to Vietnam. My mother stayed with me. That's all I can tell you, Council, on that point.
Thank you. Madame Afonso, also in your book you have written about this topic, and I wanted to read that to you to excuse me, elicit some comments, and that is the same document number as I gave earlier, and it's at ERN 00678322. I again will be quoting in French, just for the translator's benefit. And I quote your book, Madame Afonso. Le Vietnamien et les
The Vietnamese and the Cambodians of Vietnamese origin underwent authentic pogroms ordained by Lon Nol. It was a radical cleansing operation, a wave of barbaric and bloody terror in the history of Cambodia between 1970 and 1975, followed by the tidal wave of Khmer Rouge savagery. From one day to the next, all the Vietnamese were arrested and brought together in the north of the city in makeshift camps in schools and Chinese pagodas to be repatriated, quote unquote, to Vietnam. In fact, nothing of the kind happened.
And I quote, Les camps de fortune, d'infortune sont vite remplis. avec la chaleur et le manque d'hygiène, les enfants et les...
The camps were quickly emptied and cholera hit the children. And then programmed massacres were put into practice. All of those who left on the boats towards Vietnam were executed, and their bodies were thrown into the water without any kind of a trial. The women were raped, and the male and female monks were accused of complicity with the Viet Cong. They were exterminated, and their pagodas were ravaged and burned.
That's the end of the quote. And to avoid any confusion, Madame Afonso, this persecution of the Vietnamese took place during the Lon Nol years, according to your book. Is that correct?
Tout à fait.
Absolutely. It's quite true, Counsel. But don't forget that the Lon Nol regime was made up of nationalists. They were anti-Vietnamese, and they said that in the Vietnamese community there were refugee Viet Cong elements, and that is why they brought them all together and massacred them. They were nationalists.
Et toutes les maladies, tout
And all of the disease in the pagodas that I saw, that was entirely true, because I went to see people I knew who were crammed into these Chinese pagodas and these Chinese schools.
Thank you. And in that excerpt that I just read out to you, you also speak about pagodas that were burned down. What did you witness relating to those events?
It was in Kampong Speu. My mother had a friend. She had two friends who were nuns. And they were living in a pagoda located in Kampong Speu. And it was located in the province of Kampong Speu. This is where my mother's friends were. And that was the pagoda that was pillaged and burnt down, and where the nuns were massacred. But in Phnom Penh, the pagodas were spared. They were not burnt down.
So, as far as you know, this killing of the nuns took place or was conducted by the Lon Nol troops. Is that correct?
I believe that is correct, because at the time, there were only Lon Nol soldiers who were serving in the country. The Khmer Rouge had yet to come to power.
Thank you. I move on to the next topic, and that is the evacuation of Phnom Penh, the evacuation itself. And I will have only a few questions relating to this specific topic, but in your book you speak about the city being cut in 4. And if you would like me to read out the excerpt, I can do that, but maybe I can ask you like this. Do you remember the city being cut into 4 sectors at the time?
all that I remember very clearly and to this day is that everyone who lived in the south could not travel towards the north end of the city. There were roadblocks everywhere. My mother was in the western end of the city, and she wasn't able to join me. And I wasn't able to join her either. It was impossible for me to even get to the French embassy, which was in the northern end of the city, as there were roadblocks and barriers everywhere. Everybody was being evacuated according to the sector that they were living in. I was in the south, and I had to go towards the south. Last segment inaudible for the interpreter. Counsel is advised to turn off his mic when the witness is providing her response.
Thank you, Madame Afonso. I will, just to perhaps refresh your memory, indeed quote the excerpt in your book in which you speak about this division of the city. It is on to be found at the ERN 00678330, and I will quote in French. Mais cela s'avère impossible.
It was impossible. The city had been divided up into quadrants. There were soldiers in the northern sector, and they were forcing people to go in the subsequent direction, and we were in the south.
Madame Afonso, this corresponds to what you just told us, that the city was divided by roadblocks. And in your book, let me ask you the question. Is this an accurate description in your book of what you witnessed at the time?
I can tell you the following, counsel. When I realized that I could not go north, and that because I was located in the south and I was being sent southerly, I wanted to go to the western end because I wanted to join my mother. And because of that, I assumed that the city had been divvied up in that manner. I simply could not go anywhere or move forward in order to verify this. This was an assumption that I had, a conclusion that I had arrived at. Given the situation, I was waiting for my husband, who was living in the western end, and he was being evacuated in the same direction. And that's what I'm telling you today. She had to go to a different direction.
Thank you, Madame Afonso. That is very clear. I now want to move to the time that you spent in the countryside. And in your book, you speak about Ta Man, and in your book you call him a despot. Could you explain what you mean when you call him a despot?
Ta Man had arrived in the camps 2 years after our evacuation from Phnom Penh. We met him in Loti Batron. It was in the third camp. It was in the last camp that we had met Taman. He was a despot. And he was the one who initiated the purges when he arrived. I cannot list to you all of the Tas, all the uncles that I knew. There must have been a dozen. There was Takan, Taben, Taman, Tasok, Talun, Takyun, and Tasoy, the last one, who was working in Loti camp. He was the one who told us how the husbands had been massacred.
And just to be clear, Taman, what was his official position at your village? What was his title or role?
Alors, encore une fois,
Once again, if I may, I would like to consult my notes, because 32 years after the facts, I'm unable to give you the exact details. But in my book, I have described these facts extensively. Therefore, Counsel, if you happen to have the passages at hand, please consult them. Otherwise, I'm going to have to take a few moments to look at my notes.
Madame Afonso, that is no problem. I understand it is hard to remember all these facts, and I indeed can read out to you the passage in which you identify Taman. And I will again be quoting in French, and it can be found at ERN 00678383. Quote, En ce qui nous concerne,
As far as we were concerned, the village of Takren, Tasak, and Talim constituted a sahakar, which was led by a chief called Taman. He was a ruthless Yotia.
and then
លោកវិទ្យាអានម្ដងទៀតមិញស្ដាប់ខាងអ្នកបកប្រែស្ដាប់អត់បានទេអត់យល់ទេ
I think that there was an issue in translation.
លោកអានជាភាសាបារាំងតែ
When you are reading in French, I don't know if there was any implication for the translation.
Thank you, Mr. President. I think the complication may be that in French there are two Khmer words that I will read out phonetically, maybe to assist the translators. It is Sahakar and Yotea. And I...
c'était des sahakors, des coopératives.
Yes, they were sahakars, they were cooperatives.
And you then say that Taman was a Yotea sans pitié.
And you called Taman a merciless Yotia.
Is this indeed how you remember Taman?
Yes, absolutely. Inaudible for the interpreter. Counsel Pao is advised to turn off his microphone. Yes, it was from that point on that disappearances began and punishments were being meted out. If one had transgressed even moderately from the line of Angkor, they were punished. And people were sacked, and there were at least 3 or 4 villages that were grouped together at Loti-Batron, which was the last camp, if memory serves me correctly.
And so it would be correct to say that Taman was the leader of the Sahaka, as you describe it?
Yes, indeed. I'm sorry, I thought you were not finished your question. Yes, Tamman was indeed the person who was the chief of the cooperative.
And also in that book, 2 pages down at pages 00678385, you write, and I will quote in French, Sous le règne de Taman.
Under Tamman's authority, death penalties abounded.
Became president of the Sahaka. The people that were condemned to die were manifold, or were more than before.
Counsel, as I answered previously to your very last question, when Tamman arrived at the camp, there were many more disappearances. There were many more executions or punishments that were being handed out. Does that suffice as an answer, Counsel?
Thank you. That is indeed sufficient for now. You have also testified before the OCIJ, and that is a document number D199/15, and ERN is 00346936. You testified about a district chief, and you state in English, one of these paramount chiefs judged me for stealing food from a courgette field, and what's more, he spared my life. Below him were the village chiefs. End of quote. Do you remember this district chief that spared your life, and do you perhaps remember his name?
I clearly recall that episode. I didn't steal zucchinis, I stole eggplants. And I had asked, and I knew that the spy said that I was going to be sent to the West, which was tantamount to death. Perhaps there are a few details lacking, but at one point there were 2 or 3 soldiers who took me to a different village. And from that point onwards, I explained my situation to the chief of the village. And he came on bicycle. His name was Tayem. And Obviously, he asked me who I was, what I was doing there, why I stole the food, and I answered all of his questions. And I said I stole because I was hungry. I said, "Sir, I stole because I was hungry." And he replied, "Well, we're hungry as well. Why don't we steal?" And yet, throughout the entire episode, in the little straw hut, in the kitchen of the hut, there was the wife and children of the village chief who were eating fish and rice, and they were eating to their fill. And that's what I stumbled upon. I asked for forgiveness. I said that I would never commit such an act again. And that was when he started asking me questions. "So, you're French. Are you happy here in Cambodia? Are you happy here? Do you want to go back to France?" And I replied, "It depends entirely on Ankar. If Ankar wants to send me to France, it is its decision." He asked me, "Do you like the work here?" And I replied, "Yes, I'm very happy to work here." I simply told him what he wanted to hear. If I said the opposite, well, then I wouldn't be here today to tell you everything that I endured, Council. So I hope that you understand the situation.
I understand the situation, and thank you for sharing that story. Based on your experience, was it indeed the case that people like Taman, who was the head of the cooperative, and people like Tayem, who was a district chief, could decide on issues of life and death? They could decide whether you would live or die because of things you had done?
Excusez-moi.
I'm sorry, I'm afraid I didn't fully hear your question.
The President, Madam Afonso, could you please hold on and counsel for the civil parties? You may now proceed.
Mr. President, I would like my colleague to be specific about the period he is referring to. We didn't interrupt him earlier, but the evacuation from Trapan only happened as of 1976, which does not fall within the scope of this current trial. I therefore am seeking some clarifications from my esteemed colleague with respect to the exact time period he is referring to.
Thank you, colleague, for the civil parties, and I'll be happy to specify the period, but I would be asking this question relating to a rather broad period. If Madame Afonso can answer this, I am referring to the period that she spent in the countryside from the evacuation of Phnom Penh onwards until early to mid-1977. That is a period that she spent time in the countryside and experienced the realities of the life in the countryside, and I would ask her to make or give us a description of her experience at that time. And I understand that the Civil Party has not heard my question, so I will be happy to repeat the question. Madame Afonso, was it your experience during your time on the countryside, at the countryside between 1975 and 1977 that people like Tayem and Taman could decide on who would live or who would die?
Maître,
Counsel, in order to answer your question, I can only say that I only saw Tayan once when I had committed that offense. Tayan was stationed at the island with us. He certainly wielded discretionary power, and he implemented all of the orders of Ankar. He would tell us, "You have not followed Ankar's line. You must not lie. You must not do this. You must not do that." If there was any transgression from Ankar's line, we were told, "You will disappear." That is all I can tell you.
Thank you. And that takes me indeed to the next question. You spoke about this issue yesterday, but I have a few more questions on the topic. Could you explain to us once again what you at the time understood Ankar to be?
la première fois que
The first time I heard the term Ankar, I had no idea what it meant. I did not know who was Ankar. I thought it was a specific person, but it was only over the course of my cavalry, only the course of my journey towards hell, and that I understood that Ankar was the party or the organization, I don't know how you would call them today, but this was what everybody told me. Everyone who was giving us orders day after day, all of the chiefs of the villages, all of those who abused us, told us, "We are doing this on behalf of Ankar." All the village chiefs had pseudonyms. But we didn't know who was Ankar and who was at the head of Ankar.
Thank you. You testified yesterday that you also gave testimony at the trial in 1979, and you have testified that you were encouraged to speak the truth. Are you aware that documents of this trial have survived to this day, including your own statement?
jusqu'à
Up until a few years ago, I didn't know of the existence of the archives for that trial. It was only until the 90s that I realized that the sentence handed out during the first trial had not been validated. And I only received the documents that you may be referring to through my lawyer, Mr. Julien Rivet. Up until this day, I've not seen certain documents nor their English translations. And I noted that there were many deficiencies and mistakes with the French language versions and translations.
Can you tell us around when you have read those documents relating to the 1979 trial?
As I've just stated, Counsel, I only consulted those records a week ago. I did not have time to search through these archives. You will understand that when I arrived in France at the end of 1979, I had lost everything. I simply had no time to dwell in the past, and so I did not search through the archives. And it was only since the beginning of this week that my lawyer, Mr. Julien Rivet, has been able to provide me a copy of those records from the 1979 trial.
Thank you. I would like to read you a passage from your statement at that trial, and then later I will ask you if that is indeed a correct reflection of what you testified to at the time, especially because you tell us that in the French version there are a lot of deficiencies. So I want to quote from document number E3/2144R. It's the book is called Genocide in Cambodia, Documents from the Trial of Pol Pot and Ieng Sary. And the passage can be found on at ERN 00190592. And at that page you state, according to this document at least, quote, "Only when we got to the island did I figure out just what Ankar was. Ankar means the government. Anyone empowered to direct a village or a work team can always speak in the name of Ankar. Ankar is everywhere." End of quote. Is that indeed what you testified to in 1979, that anyone empowered to direct a village or a work team can always speak in the name of Ankar?
Yes, absolutely. That is exactly what I said at the time. In fact, I think there may have even been a translation error, because Ankar should not have been translated as government, but it should have been translated as organization or party. But unfortunately, I wasn't there to provide advice on the translation from Khmer into French.
If I ask you the same question in slightly different form, is it true that anyone in a position of power in those villages could claim to speak in the name of Ankar?
Yes, entirely. Let me repeat. All of the people who were leading these camps or these villages spoke in the name of Ankar, and they took their decisions in the name of Ankar. When they wanted us to work a bit more, they said, Ankar is asking for this. When they came to collect the remaining stock of rice, they said that it was because Ankar needed it. When they wanted to send our children away, it was because Ankar had decided it. So who is Ankar today? Kindly explain that to me, if you will. Today, I would like to know who Ankar is. Is this a man, an organization? Kindly enlighten me on that, Counsel, if you can.
I wish I could, Madame Afonso, but I'm afraid that's not my role. Let's hope that this trial sheds some light on that issue. And
Je vous remercie.
Thank you.
You have described the actions of Taman in your village. And based on your experience at that village and with Taman, do you think it's fair to say that the leaders of democratic Cambodia in Phnom Penh did not always know what Taman was ordering you to do in your village, even when he was speaking in the name of Angka?
The President, Madam Afonso, please hold on. International Court Prosecutor, you may now proceed.
Merci, Monsieur. Thank you, Mr. President. I believe that this question goes above and beyond what the witness can state. She said from the very start that she had never seen the people who represented Angkar at the central level, in particular the accused. So how it is reasonable to ask if Taman can take a decision with or without consulting the centre. This is not something that the witness is able to tell us about on the basis of what we have heard from her so far, and I therefore think that the civil party should not be asked to speculate on this issue because she will not be able to respond. It's not justified. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Prosecutor, for those remarks. I'm not so much asking Madame Afonso to speculate. I'm asking Madame Afonso to testify as to what she experienced when dealing with Taman, when he was disciplining on a day-to-day basis, when he was punishing people, when he was allegedly executing people. How did she perceive that? Was Taman indeed a despot with discretionary power, or was everything and every single action directed from above? But so I do think that the civil party should be able to answer this question, but in the interest of time I will move on to a next topic, and that is the last topic that I will want to ask some questions about, and that is the tribunal in 1979 that you testified before. And you told us yesterday that you were not given any instructions. The only instruction that you received was that you had to leave out the information that your husband was a communist. Do you know why they wanted you to leave that part out of your statement?
Counsel, microphone off, please. Thank you. Now, Counsel, I understand the decision taken at the time where I was asked not to talk about Mr. Phukan Singh's communist convictions. If I had said this then, that would have meant that broadly all communists would have been judged guilty. I believe this when I think about this. At the particular time, I was simply asked by Mr. Vinh Cat Vien, a Vietnamese writer, to not mention this fact. He it was. Unfortunately, he's died now. He was a great Vietnamese writer. So, with hindsight, I believe I can say that I have understood the reasons and the situation, but at the that point in time, I didn't try and understand. All I wanted to do at that time was leave that hell that I never wanted to see again. Is that enough for you, counsel?
I think I understand slightly better now, but I may get back to this minor topic at a later point if time permits. But I will move on for now. When you were attending the tribunal as a witness, did you listen to the testimony of any of the other witnesses?
Yes, counsel. I was there and I listened to the testimony of other victims who were there. There were monks, there were chums, there were women. And now, if you ask me exactly who those victims were, let me tell you that you can find their names in the archives, all of those people who came to testify in court. I didn't take any notes on that day. I was in tears. It was extremely taxing for me to hear all of that testimony. It was extremely hard.
Thank you, Madame Afonso. I will not ask you about their statements as such, but I do want to quote a part of your book again, an excerpt that can be found on page ERN 00678-421, and I will quote in French. Des avocats
Vietnamese lawyers also come to assist those who want to write out their testimony in French or in English.
Do you remember that, Madame Afonso, that Vietnamese lawyers came to assist witnesses with writing up their statements?
Well, counsel, in August 1975, we were in a hotel to prepare that trial. I didn't need a lawyer. I had a handwritten note, but I do remember that there were people who had come in from the countryside who didn't know how to read or write, and there were people who were there to help them. I didn't participate in any of those interviews, on the other hand. The only person I met was that Vietnamese writer I mentioned.
Thank you. And you testified yesterday that you had never heard of people like Pol Pot or Ieng Sary. Yet, when I read your statement before the tribunal in 1979, the names of Pol Pot and Ieng Sary are mentioned by you frequently. Can you explain why those names appeared in your statement if you did not know their names at the time? It may not. Let me ask you the question like this. Why did you use the names of Ieng Sary and Pol Pot in your statement before the tribunal in 1979?
Counsel. Pol Pot and Ieng Sary were names that I had not heard of until I came out of the hellish camps. The first question that was asked to me by a Vietnamese military doctor was, do you know who was behind all of your misfortune? And I said, I don't know. And he told me he was called Pol Pot. and there was Yang Sari. And that was the point at which I understood that those individuals were deeply involved in our wretchedness, and I quoted their names in my testimony at that time. But until I came out in January 1979, for me, these soldiers were my liberators, and if they hadn't arrived on time, I would no longer be here to be talking to you, Council.
Thank you, that is clear. In the same book that I just quoted at ERN 00190698, there is a speech that was given at the conclusion of the tribunal, and I will quote from the speech. After 5 days of sessions and with facts expounded clearly, demonstrated convincingly, and analyzed objectively, this tribunal has shed light on this truth. The crime of genocide of the Pol Pot Yang Sari clique is undeniable and indefensible. The proceedings at the tribunal have indicated that every Cambodian citizen is a victim and at the same time a witness to the most horrible crimes of Pol Pot, Yang Sari, and their associates. A bit further down, the speech continues. The People's Revolutionary Tribunal of the Cambodian people, with probity and uprightness and following normal legal procedure, has condemned Pol Pot and Yang Sari to death, thus unmasking their reactionary nature, promoting the Cambodian people's just cause, and affirming the role of the People's Revolutionary Council of Cambodia as the only authentic, legitimate representative of the people of Cambodia. End of quote. This was a speech that was given by then President Mr. Heng Samrin, in which he describes that and stresses that every Cambodian citizen is a victim and at the same time a witness to the most horrible crimes of Pol Pot, Yang Sari, and their associates. And was given at a reception in honor of foreign guests. My question to you, Madame Afonso, did you attend that speech given by President Heng Samrin?
No, Council. I wasn't there for that speech. And when I read it out, I didn't really understand who was talking. Now that you've told us, I understand, but I wasn't there. I was called to testify one morning only. I told them everything I had to say, and after that I was released. So I didn't follow all 5 days of that particular tribunal's proceedings, so I do not remember that.
Then I will not ask you any further questions on this topic. Madame Afonso, I have no further questions on behalf of the Nunchia Defense Team. Also, in the name of Mr. Sonarun, Cambodian co-counsel, I thank you very much for your answers, and I wish you good luck and strength in the future. And I will cede the floor to my colleagues if they have further questions.
Je vous remercie, Maître.
Thank you, Council.
The President, thank you, Council. We would like now to hand over to councils for Mr. Yang Sari to put some questions to Madam Civil Party if they would wish to do so. Council Hangudam. Good afternoon, Mr. President. Good afternoon to you, Your Honors. and good afternoon to everyone in and around the courtroom, and good afternoon to you, Madam Dennis Afonso. I am Counsel Ang Udam, and on my right-hand side, my colleague Michael Canavas. We are counsels for Mr. Ieng Sari. For the moment, we do not have any questions to put to you. Nonetheless, we thank you so much indeed for your time. The President thanks you, counsels. We would like now to proceed to counsel for Mr. Kyew Sampon to put some questions to the civil party. Counsel Kung Sampon. Thank you, Mr. President. On behalf of Mr. Kyew Sampon, we do not have any questions to put to the civil party. We thank you. The President, thank you, counsels. Madam Afonso, it is now the opportunity, as promised, for you, as a civil party, to state or to make the statement of your suffering, the sufferings you have endured during the Khmer Rouge regime. If you wish to do so, the floor is now yours.
Je vous remercie.
Thank you, Mr. President. Indeed, yes. I would like to say today that throughout that entire period, I suffered a huge amount. My life had been proceeding happily in a peaceful country, and it suddenly switched to hell. And from one day to the next, people were expropriated, chased out of their houses. Everything that you had built in 30 years was demolished. I was aged 30, and everything that I lived through in those 30 years was destroyed from one day to the next. I have undergone an awful lot of harm as a result. Firstly, physical, from the fact that we didn't have any kind of medical care or doctors, and that we were malnourished and lived in total absence of any hygiene. I contracted a great many diseases. The major one was tuberculosis. If the soldiers, the invaders, if you like, did not arrive on time, then I wouldn't be here today. I was looked after for 3 months in the Saint-Antoine Hospital in France for the tuberculosis. I also caught hepatitis B and malaria. I have sequelae from both still. I still have attacks of malaria, because you don't get rid of malaria. And those are the physical kinds of harm I suffered. When you are undergoing malaria and you're pulled out of your hut to go and work in the rice fields under a beating sun, then I would really like to ask you, Mr. President, judges, kindly imagine what it must have been like. As to moral prejudice, I simply can't describe what I've been through. We were deported. We were forced to leave our homes. We were told lies, saying it was just for a few days. Well, in fact, when you leave your house, you never, ever see it again. You don't see any of your possessions again. Once you are in the fields, you're obliged to work. But in addition, as working, back-breaking work, you are laughed at. You're made a mockery of. Your children are taken away from you without even telling you where they're going. They simply told you, Ankar are looking after your children. They're no longer your children. Don't worry about them. And when you get back to your children, in fact, they aren't your children anymore, because they've been completely indoctrinated and changed. When you see your daughter dying of hunger, and she says, Mummy, can I have a bowl of rice? And I was never able to give her that bowl of rice. before she died, then I can tell you I have undergone harm. Everything I really want to know is, have these people been punished? I appear to be in reasonable health, but I can tell you inside my head it's not healthy at all. I have to be healthy for other people, for my son, for his children. I have to stay in good health for them. I'm in a world where you have to work to survive. So imagine what it's like. And ask yourselves how I survived. And when you ask me about harm, about all the atrocities, all the torture scenes, for a young Chinese woman who stole some palm sugar and who was stretched out and tied to the ground in the sun while we had to watch. Do you think any kind of human rights were respected there? Do you think we were human beings at all? We weren't. We were totally dehumanized. We became animals. We were utterly dehumanized. That's all I have to say today. And let me tell you again and again, if you want to listen to me, that famine was organized and programmed. It was a way for the system to eliminate us while feeling they had washed their hands of the problem. But they could say, we didn't kill those people, they died because they'd been eating rubbish. Is that not a technique to assassinate somebody without getting your hands dirty? To do this without giving us any care and any medical assistance is a way to simply kill people, and it was programmed in advance. And that is why I can tell you that my nights are filled with nightmares. That's why I no longer wish to set foot in that country, which I do love. 30 years have gone by and I no longer wish to set foot in that country because I am plagued by nightmares. I'm haunted by everything I went through. And in my head, I can tell you, how is it possible that the people of Cambodia endured all of that? I wasn't alone. There were another 2 million Cambodians who suffered this physically and morally. Now that they can speak, I hope they are liberated. We have a very, very high price to pay. I can't rebuild my life. I can't start a new family. I miss my daughter. I only have my son. And that son was so traumatized that he never ever talks about this. He was tortured. He was beaten. And I want this court to do its work and the people who committed all of these acts to be duly punished. Thank you very much, Mr. President, and the entire court.
The President, the Chamber wishes to thank you very much indeed, Madam Afonso. Your testimony has now come to a conclusion. We hope the testimony of yours will be contributing to ascertaining the truth, and you are now excused. We wish you all the very best. And at the same time, the Chamber wishes to thank you, Counsel Juliet Rivet. And the hearing on the testimony of Madame Afonso now comes to an end. Goodbye, ma'am.
បាទអ្នកបច្ចេកទេសខាងប្រព័ន្ធថតទស្សន៍អាច
The President Court officer is now instructed to assist with the AV booth officers to ensure that the video conference is disconnected, and the chamber would like to now hand over to parties to the proceedings to make any observations, if any, on the statement of suffering just made by Madame Afonso.
បាទទំនងជាមិនមាន
It appears to the chamber that there is none, and the chamber wishes to also inform the parties and the public that next the chamber proceeds to hear the testimonies of witness Pan Van alias Kampan, as the chamber already informed the parties this morning that this witness would be on standby in case the testimony of Madame Afonso could be concluded early. Now it is appropriate time for some break. The court will adjourn for 15 minutes. The next session will be resumed by 5 to 4. Court officer, rather a quarter to 4.
Sure.